You're listening to the Unfixed podcast.
I got stuck in self-blame for a long time. But I think part of that was because if I could identify this thing that caused me to get sick, then maybe I could fix that thing. So it was like this weird backwards form of hope in a way. It was like, if I can find the problem, then there must be a solution.
Hi, everyone. This is the Unfixed podcast, and I'm your host, Martel Catalano. The chronic illness community often talks to each other, but in this show, we open the dialogue, exploring adversity through different walks of life to recognize our shared humanness. These intimate conversations are between people who are creatively contending with diverse challenges. One person has a chronic health condition, because they're often experts in facing the hard stuff. The other is a professional working within a relevant field or facing their own unique battle. Each episode is an invitation to lean into curiosity and compassion while recognizing that we can live powerful lives despite, or sometimes because of, our circumstances. This podcast is part of a suite of resources provided by Beyond My Battle. If you feel inclined to support the show, you can do so at beyondmybattle.org/donate. That quote we opened with was from Tessa Miller. She's a New York-based health and science journalist whose work focuses on chronic illness and disability. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, Self, Medium, Refinery 29, Wired, and Vice, among other places. Tessa was a senior editor at Lifehacker and The Daily Beast. Her debut book, What Doesn't Kill You: A Life with Chronic Illness, Lessons from a Body in Revolt, is part memoir about Tessa's life with Crohn's disease and part guide for newly diagnosed patients and their families. It was published February 2nd, 2021 via Macmillan. Tessa is a graduate of Northwestern University and has turned into a New Yorker who now resides in Brooklyn with her husband, Greg, a public service law student, and their 4 dogs. We're excited today for Tessa to share a conversation with a bright young woman, Zoe, who just happens to also be Tessa's niece. Tessa and Zoe have a unique bond that goes beyond the typical aunt-niece relationship. Early in Tessa's diagnosis of Crohn's disease, Zoe literally saved her life. Zoe Miller is a junior in high school. She competes in Illinois High School Association speech, which she describes as competitive public speaking, and was a 2020 national semifinalist. She's also involved with Girls in STEM and was selected to participate in the 2020 St. Louis College of Pharmacy high school summer program. Zoe's ambition is to study biology in college and to go on to medical school. She was born with sensory neural hearing loss, but you would never know about her disability upon meeting her. Alongside using hearing aids, she lip reads effortlessly and adapts successfully to the world around her. When she isn't doing schoolwork, Zoe loves to read books, sing and play music, and travel with her family, especially to New York City and Newport, Oregon. Together, these two are here with us today to share an intimate conversation about their story together, how they both traverse the continuum between fixing and accepting in their own lives, and the unique bond that they share. Tessa and Zoe, I'm so happy to speak with you both today.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
We're so excited. We've been looking forward to this for weeks.
Definitely.
Great. We've been looking forward to it as well. Tessa, I was able to go through some of your book, and I want you to tell our listeners why you chose to dedicate it, the book that is, to Zoe. I think that will really set the stage for this conversation today.
Sure. Yeah. I knew I was going to dedicate the book to Zoe before the book was even done. There just wasn't any question about who it would be dedicated to. And there are a few reasons why I dedicated it to her. The most obvious reason, which we're going to get into later in the conversation, is that when I got really sick in 2013, I had Crohn's disease. And then while I was hospitalized, I developed this bacterial superbug called C. diff, which basically worms its way into your colon and starts these deadly toxins that take over the lining of your large intestine. Doctors tried to treat me with rounds and rounds and rounds of antibiotics to get rid of it, and nothing was working. So sort of the top of the pyramid treatment for C. diff is what's called a fecal transplant. And that's exactly what it sounds like. You take the stool of a healthy person and you transplant it into the gut of the unhealthy person, basically via colonoscopy. So in 2013, when I needed that procedure done, Zoe, who was only 9 years old at the time, was my donor. So that's the sort of obvious reason why I dedicated the book to her, because she quite literally saved my life. And the other reason that I dedicated the book to Zoe is because the book is about chronic illness, but it's also about our family. And it's about sort of histories of trauma within our family and the secrets that children keep for their parents. And I wanted Zoe to know when she reads this book that she doesn't have to carry that burden. Like it's not her burden to keep the secrets of bad stuff that happened in our family. I want her to feel free of those things. I want her to know that we can openly communicate about the past traumas between generations of our family. And I want her to know that she can be free from those. She can be free to be whatever she wants to be and not feel burdened by a lot of that intergenerational pain. So those are the two main reasons. And the third reason that I dedicated the book to her is because I love her. She's like a little sister to me. We're only 15 years apart. We spent the first several years of Zoe's life living in the same house. We've been as close as sisters ever since. And I just couldn't think of anyone else I would rather dedicate this book to.
That's so special. I love that bond. I have a really similar bond with a cousin of mine in my family. I know, not firsthand, but because my best friend is an organ transplant recipient twice over, that the donor-recipient relationship is quite unique.
Yeah.
You know, some people never know their donors for certain things, but for those who do know their donors, it's undeniably profound, and you're already related. But can you both talk about what the donor-recipient part of your relationship has been like, or what that has done to your bond?
Yeah. Zoe, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I know we talked about this earlier. I think a lot of it for us now is like humor. Like we joke about it a lot just because the world has changed so much with like fecal transplants that now it's like you get like a stool and you don't even know who the person is that you're getting it from. But back when I did it, it was like, well, here I am in New York and you're carrying my poop in a blender across Times Square. So I think that a lot of our relationship now is just humor based because it's such an odd thing to look back on.
Yeah, the process of getting a fecal transplant has changed quite a bit. It's very sterile. You get the stool from a stool bank where it's all sort of cryogenically preserved, and you don't know who your donor is, although they've gone through rigorous testing to be able to donate. And it's all coordinated behind the scenes from the hospital where you get the procedure. But for us in 2013, it was, you had to find your own donor, which is how I had to get Zoe. And the protocol was that you bring the quote unquote sample to the hospital in a brand new blender. And so you pass the blender off to the team who's going to do the procedure. They mix it with saline. They transplant it as they would doing a colonoscopy. And that has just changed so much over the last not even 10 years. So we laugh about it a lot, that it was just such a absurd experience, flying a 9-year-old to New York so that she could poop in a blender, and then that poop would be used to save my life. And so, yeah, we laugh about it a lot. I mean, we have such a close bond anyway that in some ways the donor-recipient relationship didn't seem all that weird, because we just do anything for each other anyway. If the roles were reversed and Zoe needed something from me to save her life, I mean, I would be there in a second. It's the same with her mom, my older sister. At this point, it's something more that we laugh about. I mean, obviously, we're so thankful that it worked, but we also see this sort of absurd humor in the whole situation.
Yeah, I know it has a pretty serious success rate.
Yeah, it's extremely successful. I mean, most of the time it's like an 80 to 90% success rate. And sometimes people need another one. And then the success rate goes up even more. I ended up needing 2 more fecal transplants in 2015 when I had recurrent C. diff during another long hospitalization in the spring of 2015. And unfortunately, then the first one that I had just didn't really take. And then the second one that I had, my colon was in such bad shape from months of active Crohn's disease that the bacteria that had been basically sprayed into my colon via the fecal transplant crossed through the borders of my colon and basically leached into my abdomen. So I wound up with an E. coli infection and sepsis. And so that did not go as well. I mean, fecal transplants are amazing. I wish that they were more first line care rather than end of the line. People have to fail rounds and rounds and rounds of other treatments before they'll even be considered for a fecal transplant. When there's this procedure right there that is extremely successful, it's low cost, there's not much recovery from it.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It definitely come up in conversations I've had with physicians. So I agree with you. And I want to talk about those kind of challenges that you encountered. Zoe, you have a condition that's largely remedied by hearing aids and proficient lip reading. And Tessa, you've received this life-saving transplant that helped you feel much, much better, I know, within 48 hours of the transplant, at least at the beginning. And there have also been constant disappointments. I think I read in your book, misdiagnoses, even botched procedures, and lots of challenges living with your conditions as there are with any chronic condition or disability. And I'm a big believer that you don't have to have the same or even similar diagnosis to someone to learn from them and about coping or the illness and disability experience in general. In fact, I feel like the more different it is, the less you compare yourself to them, and therefore the more you can evolve and talk about the deeper stuff. So what have you learned from each other about all that, and how to best navigate the obstacles and uncertainties of just the world of illness and disability?
I think the biggest thing I've learned from my aunt is that you can't let your illness kill your spirit. Like, even when I was younger, and she would be home for the holidays, or like even when I was in New York for the fecal transplant, if I hadn't have been told what was going on, I would have never known that like something was going on behind the scenes. So I think the biggest lesson I've learned from you is your illness or your disability might take over your body, but just to not let it take over like your mind and your spirit.
From you, I think the biggest thing I've learned is to be adaptable and flexible. I also am always inspired by watching you learn how to advocate for yourself. We were just having a conversation about this last night, actually. Like, Zoe needs to sit at the front of her classrooms because she can't hear when she's in the back. The way that her hearing loss works, if you look at her charts, it looks like there's been kind of a bite taken out of the graph. They call it cookie bite hearing loss because there's like ranges that she can hear, and then this cookie bite where she can't hear, and then some ranges that she can hear. And when she's in the classroom, it becomes extremely difficult to hear like what the teacher is saying unless she's at the front of the classroom. She's slowly but surely coming into her own as she advocates for herself, even for something as simple as like telling her teacher that she needs to sit at the front of the class instead of the back. And, you know, sometimes it's still hard for me, even after 10 years of being ill, to speak up for my own needs in the healthcare system. So I look to her a lot, and she makes me brave enough to speak up for what I need as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, I appreciate both of those things, and I, both of those insights. I think that they speak to exactly what I again feel so strongly about, which is that you don't need to have the same thing as someone to learn from them about illness.
I actually want to ask Zoe a question about that because we were just talking about this last night, and she did tell me that she was having some trouble advocating for her place in the classroom, and that she had approached a teacher and said, "Hey, I have hearing loss. I really need to sit in the front of the class instead of the back," and was kind of like brushed off. So I was wondering if maybe both of us could give her some adult advice about how we might handle a situation like that, because she did tell me that she just still gets nervous repeatedly asking for what she needs. Zoe, did you think about that any more last night, about what your next steps might be?
Yeah, I think, with COVID right now, we're kind of like in between, like we'll be in person sometimes and then at home completely online other times. So I feel like when we go back, I'll probably try to talk to her about it again. But yeah, it is like really nerve-wracking, especially when like a authority figure brushes off your disability like it's not important to her. When like I had to be in her classroom and asked her twice and never saw any change. So I definitely think it makes me more anxious to confront someone for like a third time when my request wasn't respected the first time, especially from an authority figure. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about this a little bit, like you have rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And one of those is that you should be able to ask for reasonable accommodations and have them met. And that is a completely reasonable accommodation, just to,
right.
to move you from the back of the room to the front.
Right.
So I don't know if that means maybe bringing in a parent or something so that you feel a little bit more comfortable. Zoe told me that she leaves the classroom almost in tears because she hasn't heard a word that the teacher has said when she's in the back of the room. It gets at one of these things too, where it's like her disability, same with my illness, like it isn't immediately visible. So your teacher probably thinks, oh, you don't look like you have hearing loss, whatever that means.
Yeah, I can relate to that, Zoe, big time. The feelings that you are not being seen or taken seriously,
right.
And yet you then go into this spiral of like, well,
right.
I don't want it to be worse. I don't
right.
want it to be visible. I don't want, but
yeah.
You find yourself like in that weird in between of like, do I wish my condition was more obvious to the outside world so that it would be taken seriously, but I'm happy that it is the way that it is for myself? And
right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. It would be so much easier if it could be known that like, and I know this might go for you too, I can achieve the same tasks as other people. Like I can engage in conversation, I can listen to a lecture, I can, do all of that,
right.
But it takes so much more effort.
Yeah, and it needs some accommodations, none of which are that difficult to make happen.
Right. Yeah, it would just be so much easier if people understood that, like, me engaging in conversation, I'm achieving the same thing as you, but I'm working 10 times harder to do it.
I wrote about that some in the book about like there are a lot of privileges that come from having chronic illnesses and disabilities that are mostly invisible because they let you move around a world sort of unseen. But then when you do ask for accommodations or when you are asking for medical attention and you get well, you don't look sick or you don't look like you can't hear or you can't see. And then the burden of proof falls on you to have to like prove to these people that, yes, I am sick. Yes, I am disabled. And that in itself can create a lot of stress too.
Definitely.
Just having to repeatedly sort of like come out as chronically ill or disabled over and over and over again.
Right. And I know for me, at least as like a teenager, I guess, the biggest thing I've had to like grapple with is learning that like my disability is not an inconvenience and that like other people being comfortable is not worth me not being able to hear or anything like that. So I know that that's been like one of the hardest things, I guess, to deal with. And that goes along with advocating for myself.
Do you feel like you're becoming more comfortable with self-advocating as you get older?
Yeah, definitely as I get older. There's still times where like I know when I went up to my teacher the first time, I was like internally panicking, which is still, I guess, like the same now, but it's definitely getting easier with time.
Yeah.
Well, you're much, you're definitely, I think it brings a resilience to you, Zoe, at your age, such a resilient quality that most teenagers don't encounter until maybe later in life, if at all. And just thinking back to my high school experience when I had already had my diagnosis and already had been experiencing vision loss for a while, I did definitely not talk to my teachers and about it, and I would kind of suffer through the weird circumstances, or if it was a field trip somewhere that was dark, I would find like the one friend who I trust to hold my hand and then deal with getting made fun of for holding hands with someone and just suck it up. So there's these trade-offs.
Totally. I dealt with that even into my early 20s, my mid 20s, even into my late 20s, like when my disease would be flaring at work, I didn't want to be in the bathroom all the time at the office. I didn't know how to tell people that I was in there because I have an incurable condition that makes me have to go to the bathroom all the time. And like, I'm not in there because I'm quote unquote lazy or like weird or whatever. I was always so worried about what everyone in the office was thinking of me. And that was even, into my mid 20s, into full adulthood, when I should have been able to better advocate for myself. But like those feelings of embarrassment and shame and stuff, they don't just rapidly disappear all of a sudden.
Yeah, and our brains literally cling to the experiences that are the worst. That's part of our evolution as human beings. Our brains are preconditioned to remember the dangerous and the worst case scenarios so that we can avoid them in the future. Whereas we tend to forget about all the amazing times that people have helped us. Like, I would say that it took me equally as long, Tessa, into my mid-20s to realize that telling people, advocating for myself, I was encountered with so much more loving kindness and compassion than I was the times where I encountered a real jerk. And I had to reflect on like, wow, I guess majority of people do want to help or understand or are curious to learn more. And it's just about the way that you communicate. And it's on us in a lot of ways to be that communicator. I always remind people, like, there's a lot of conversation in the social media world, especially about like I should receive an award for the times where I've faked being okay. And I'm like, no, you shouldn't. You should totally tell people that you're not okay. And you should definitely speak up and let people know that you're not okay. And if the people around you don't want to hear it, then you need to try to find new people. That's such a message that's out there. And I want to dismantle that. And I think, you, Zoe, learning at such a young age that you have to ask for those accommodations or tell your friends, it's only going to serve you and throughout the rest of your life.
Definitely.
Yeah. And it will get easier, I've found too. Because once I really dedicated myself to advocating and telling people this is what I need when I need it, it becomes much easier and less anxiety provoking. But I wrote about that in the book, in that the first time I wrote about being diagnosed with chronic illness and going through the first fecal transplant, I was absolutely terrified to publish it. I was encouraged by my editor that it would be a really important piece and that we should publish it. But I was so scared because I thought people would say, this is gross. I thought people would think, oh, she's that sick girl, and that's all they would think of me. I was scared that if I went to a job interview and somebody Googled me, that this would come up and they'd be like, oh, you're unable to do this work or whatever. I just thought, I expected the worst. Like you were saying, I ran through 1,000 of the worst case scenarios. And then when the piece came out, I was just overwhelmed with people reaching out to me being like, I have a similar illness. This really made me feel seen. Or I have a family member who's been suffering with C. diff for months and months and months, and we didn't even know what a fecal transplant is. And now we're looking for one for them. I got emails from parents being like, my child has Crohn's and this is one of the, best things that I've read about that experience. And so it was the complete opposite. It was just overwhelming kindness and acceptance. And that was the first real experience in my early diagnosis where I started to chip away at some of that shame that came with my illnesses.
The quest to fix our health situation and the journey of accepting our circumstances live on a fluid continuum, or they're kind of on opposite sides of the spectrum in a sense. And I think I speak for myself and many others when I say that we walk this fine line of not identifying solely with our disease or disability and knowing that our spirit is so much more than just our diagnosis, but also not living in denial that and knowing that it is part of us and owning that and having that sense of ownership of our story. Where are you both right now on that continuum with your diagnosis?
COVID has honestly changed a lot for me in regards to school, I guess, because school has been one of the biggest areas where my hearing loss has affected me. So I think right now, mine definitely ebbs and flows. Some days it's really easy for me to accept it because when I'm at home, on Zoom, and even right now, I have headphones in and I can hear everything perfectly. But then when I'm out in school and out in public, adjusting to a world where I can't lip read, and adjusting to a world where everyone's wearing masks. And I know you guys could probably both speak to this, even as people with perfect hearing, it's hard to hear. I know I've talked to a lot of friends about that. So for me personally, being in a world where I can't rely on lip reading has been really, really hard. And I know it's provoked a lot of anger in me rather than acceptance of my condition. And it's caused for a lot of awkward encounters, just at the grocery store and things like that just make me really, really anxious because, I have to ask people to repeat themselves more than I usually do. And I can't rely on lip reading. And so, yeah, adjusting to that has definitely been a struggle. And it's definitely honestly moved me away from the acceptance side of things more than I have been in past years.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, acceptance, I kind of compare it to grief in that it really ebbs and flows, and that sometimes you feel differently about it at one moment in time than you would at another. I have accepted, I would say close to 100%, that I have a disease called Crohn's that is incurable. But part of the reason that I've been able to accept that is because I found a wonderful team of doctors who oversee my care. And I found the medication that I take now, which is a immunosuppressant infusion medication that keeps me pretty stable. So I think when you're feeling physically pretty good, it's easier to be on the acceptance side of the spectrum. When I'm sicker and when my symptoms flare up and when I'm in a lot of pain, I'm farther away from that acceptance point, which I think, is common amongst all chronically ill people. But the other thing is that I have other health issues that have sprung up on top of Crohn's disease. So whereas I'm pretty accepting of my Crohn's disease, and I really know how to manage it, and I know what to do when my symptoms flare up and all this stuff. But I also have recently, doctors discovered that I have these 2 ovarian masses. So now I'm like kind of hyper fixated on fixing that problem. And I'm just back to, reading everything I can about the surgery and what might go wrong and all this stuff. You're all familiar with the late night doom scroll when it comes to having a health issue. I'm always sort of all over that spectrum.
Yeah, it sounds like an anxiety brain space for you.
It definitely is. My physical health is so intimately connected to my mental health, and for me, that usually presents as anxiety.
Where some people, it tends to present as depression or just like shutting down. Like you have more of a fight response.
Mine is just this cycle of like, I'm going to figure out the problem. I'm going to figure out the solution. And I did that at first when I was first diagnosed with Crohn's, and I didn't really understand like what chronic meant or like what incurable meant. I definitely spiraled into some of those. What can I do to fix this? But also I spiraled into what could I have done to prevent this?
Yes. Yeah. The blame, guilt.
Diving back into the whole history of my years, thinking like, okay, well, was it because Crohn's is a combination of genetic factors and environmental factors. That's sort of the best explanation we have for what causes this disease. And so I was just going back through all the timeline of my years, being like, okay, well, was it growing up in an abusive home? Was it the fact that I struggled with disordered eating as a teenager? Like, did that throw off my microbiome in some way? There were just all these things I was going over and over and over again. And I got stuck in self-blame for a long time. But I think part of that was because if I could identify this thing that caused me to get sick, then maybe I could fix that thing. So it was like this weird backwards form of hope in a way. It was like, if I can find the problem, then there must be a solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this comes up. This kind of anxiety is so common in the chronic illness community, especially more with the autoimmune, gastrointestinal. I find just through my millions of conversations with people and running support groups for people, this kind of investigation and self-blame tends to be so common. And, knowing that Zoe, I'm sure you can relate, like, hearing loss, vision loss. I don't tend to think like, oh man, if only I had done this. There's really pretty much nothing I could have done. And knowing that's my reality and this is their reality, I do always try to put myself in the people that I'm talking to shoes and help them get through that, because I've definitely gone through the shame experience and all that. But my question is always like, okay, so say you do figure it out. Say you do figure out what did this, then what? You're still here.
Right.
Like you're still right here where you are. So we need to work on, letting go of that, that spiral, because it is such a useless, expensive energy that for you, all these people living with chronic conditions, that exerted stress of wondering and investigating and doom scrolling and blaming ourselves, shaming ourselves is really detrimental to our health. And it takes so long to get to that other side. And that's kind of the full circle of that question of like, do we completely own our condition so much that it owns us? Or do we, not identify with it so much that it's a denial thing? And really we have to be somewhere in the middle. But I think that place in the middle ultimately ends up being, at least through my experience and the experience of my mentors, is a place where we don't look back on the past very much. Just it is what it is. And there's nothing we can do back then.
Yeah, I think I stopped doing that after the first couple years of my diagnosis. I mean, it was sort of this like frantic searching back on what could have caused this when I first got sick. But then as I started to sort of dive into the history of my health as I was writing the book, like really I was sick from birth. I was sick from childhood. And, how am I going to blame myself as a baby for being sick? And it's the same with Zoe. I mean, she was born with her hearing condition, and it was just something there was some sort of nerve damage in the womb that she was born with. And there really was nothing that anyone could have anticipated or changed for. But yeah, I totally agree with what you said about that sort of frantic searching will only make you sicker. And I wrote about this in the book. My doctor, who I love so much, who really is just the guy that has saved my life over and over again, he told me that you can do everything right. You can take your medication on time. You can come to your doctor's appointments. But if you're constantly in these stress and anxiety cycles, like trying to figure out how to fix yourself, you're not going to be able to feel better. Like he just kept telling me this. And that was something really important that I needed to hear, especially because that really forced me to reevaluate some of the other stuff that was going on in my life too. I was working all hours in really busy, stressful newsrooms, and I was internalizing a lot of the just horrific stories that we were covering, bringing them home with me at night. And like all that stuff just lived in my belly. Like I just was always sick. And it took me a really long time to accept that my mind and my body were not two separate entities, but were a very intimate partnership. And that if I was abandoning my brain and treating my brain badly, my body was suffering for it, and vice versa.
I want to talk about the book specifically, your book's title, What Doesn't Kill You, other than the obvious, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But how would you complete that sentence now? And do you feel it's still true for you? Was it always true for you? Is it true for everyone? Are there people you've encountered who have found this phrase not true. Like I've read, what doesn't kill you actually makes you weaker. And or like that, it's kind of pull yourself up from the bootstraps, and not everyone has those boots. And I'm kind of wondering, Tessa, like where, you don't complete the sentence in the title of your book. And is that intentional?
That's intentional. So the original title of the book was Sick Forever. And somewhere along the line with the publisher, they decided that Sick Forever was too depressing. So we threw around some other title ideas, and I liked this one so long as we only used half of it. And it's kind of tongue in cheek. I want it to be read in a literal sense, in that chronic illness doesn't kill you compared to terminal illness, which we kind of go over in the beginning of the book. What doesn't kill you, it means this is an illness that you live with for life. It can be managed, but it can't be cured. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger is a phrase that I actually hate because it isn't true at all. There is something called post-traumatic growth, which it does present opportunities to become more resilient or more open-minded or more brave or more connected or whatever after you've gone through something traumatic. But for that to happen, it requires tons of resources. You have to have mental health care and physical health care, and you have to have community support, and you have to have social support. So the phrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, it makes it sound like you automatically come out of a bad thing as a stronger person. And that's just absolute bullshit. Trauma really can beat you down and make you not at all stronger. And unless you're surrounded and uplifted by all of these resources, that just isn't the case for a lot of people. So I really don't like that phrase. So that's why the title is supposed to be tongue-in-cheek.
I'm so glad that you elaborated on that. I couldn't, as I was reading your book, I couldn't help coming back to it and being like, but is this true? Or I don't think I feel this way. And Zoe, when you write your book one day, and of course dedicated to Tessa, what do you think your motivation will be behind it? Or maybe it's not a book, but a speech that you give.
Yeah, we were talking about this earlier. I think that for me, speaking of like when I'm an adult someday, I think the way, as opposed to like a book, the way that my career would honor her would be in the medical field, because her condition and her illness was such a major factor in, I guess, growing my interest in that. So while I might never write a book, my hopeful career would definitely be in honor of everything she's been through and helping people as she was helped by so many people.
That's so sweet. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave our listeners with that I didn't get to, like a question that you wanted to ask each other?
I want to make the point that, like, if people are listening to this and thinking about getting the book, we've talked about a lot of some of the darker parts of it, the hospitalizations and the fear of death and the shame and all of that stuff. But I also want them to know that the arc of this book really bends toward a really deep, profound joy.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been such a great conversation. I really enjoyed talking to both of you, and I loved learning about your special bond, and Tessa, about your book. Listeners can learn more about Tessa and Zoe by heading to the episode page on beyondmybattle.org or unfixedfilm.com. Tessa's deeply insightful and sometimes harrowing memoir is an essential companion and guide for anybody who's been diagnosed with a chronic condition. We'll have it in the resource library at beyondmybattle.org, in addition to other books that we recommend. The Unfixed podcast is a collaboration between Unfixed Media Productions and Beyond My Battle, a nonprofit helping people reduce the stress of illness and disability. If you want to learn more about the Unfixed documentary, Visit unfixedfilm.com or subscribe to the Unfixed Community YouTube channel. As always, if this show or particular episode resonated with or helped you in some way, please leave us a review or share with your friends and family.